I'm Teri Willey, Vice President for Technology and Business Development at Mount Sinai, where we're engaged in continuing the mission of this institution and making sure that the results of our research and scholarly activities reach the public and patients in a meaningful way. And we do that through collaborations with the corporate world, with industry, in developing robust research programs, in licensing intellectual property for the purpose of product development, and engaging in new ventures. It's a long-term and risky activity, quite frankly, and we often don't know for several years once we embark on something whether it's really going to have a meaningful impact. And because of that, we focus very hard on doing a lot of good deals. A lot of deals because you never are quite sure which things are going to be valuable and you want to place a lot of bets. Deals because they represent a commitment of Mount Sinai and that company or that investor to solve a problem or bring a product forward. And good deals, as we define them, are deals that have the potential for a robust and strong societal impact. They have the potential for a meaningful financial impact on Mount Sinai. And very importantly, it's a deal that builds the relationship with our innovators and the companies that we're working with. And we're very fortunate to have representatives from 4 of those companies here today. And I'd just like to briefly introduce them before we start with the questions. First, John Sninsky, Vice President of Discovery Research at Celera. He is involved in a lot of areas, but one of his focus areas is the application of genetic and genomic tools to identify and develop diagnostic and pharmacogenomic assays, so a nice follow-on to what we were just talking about. Uwe Schoenbeck, who is Chief Scientific Officer for Pfizer. He leads Pfizer's worldwide research and development and external R&D innovation team, which is very involved in working with small companies and academic institutions to advance technology and therapies. We're very involved at Mount Sinai with the CTI program at Pfizer, which is an innovative program to engage with academics to solve important problems. It's often been described as a very un-big pharma program. And so I hope we'll get to hear a little bit about that. Paul Stoffels, who's Chief Scientific Officer and Worldwide Chairman of Pharmaceuticals for Janssen & Janssen. He works with stakeholders across Johnson & Johnson to set the enterprise-wide innovation agenda, which is quite a job because if you look at the companies that make up Johnson & Johnson, there are many of them. We're involved with Johnson & Johnson in a number of very interesting discussions for emerging research projects in a variety of areas, including immunology, small molecule development to treat cardiovascular disease, and CNS to better understand and treat depression. And Mansuri, who's the Senior Vice President for Gilead Pharmaceuticals. He's got an extensive biotech and venture background, and he's leading a company that is developing a reputation for being a preferred partner with academic institutions, and not just because of the money that they're investing in academic collaborations, but because of the types of terms they put in place for those collaborations that really encourage and align interests and motivate our researchers to do their most creative and innovative work with that funding. And so with that, we're looking forward to hearing from our panel. Thanks.
So let me begin and pose what I think is a real challenge for academia and for the pharmaceutical industry, and that's the following paradox. We in academia, driven in part by NIH funding and our own creativity, are a real engine for discovery. We can fill a pipeline. Pharmaceutical industry finds itself at another crossroads where the business model's been questioned. The ability to provide blockbuster drugs, billion-dollar drugs, becomes harder and harder to achieve. And they've moved more and more to the development side than the discovery side. So they have a pipeline to fill. It's clear that society needs us to work together. Society needs our discovery, and we need their development, and we need a collaboration. On the other hand, we've seen in the last decade that excesses from the academics and excesses from the pharmaceutical industry have been notarized in the press to besmirch academia and to besmirch pharmaceutical industry. And the consequence has been that the interface between us has never been more difficult to manage. So what I'd like to ask the panel, and to just go through one at a time, is how do you think we can navigate these very difficult waters to mutually benefit each other in a time that has become so difficult and we're under so much scrutiny about the nature of our relationship?
Interesting question. So maybe I'll start by saying that the glasses that I bring to answering this question, I spent time in academics, I spent time in a biotechnology company, I spent time in a large pharmaceutical company, and now Celera is part of Quest Diagnostics, a very large CLIA laboratory. So the way I kind of look at these is through each of those glasses, sometimes at the same time. And that is that two thoughts. One is that what's absolutely critical is transparency. Where those two institutions have gotten into trouble in the past is when things haven't been absolutely transparent. So that's critically important. The second element is the fact that the baton has to be passed further down the track than it has in the past. The way I've kind of taken a look at it in the past is that things have been sort of hit over the net and expected to be picked up. And that's not going to work. It really requires a close working collaboration in terms of making things go forward. And then as part of that, I think everybody has to have a stronger statistical foundation in terms of thinking of some of the data that we have. Let me give you one example. The expectation is that if you do a small study and you get really good results, that by definition, if you do a big study, those results will be good. People don't think about what's called the winner's curse. People don't think about the fact that not only if you don't have the power in a study, not only do you risk getting a false negative, but you also risk a false positive. So I think we need to be transparent. I think that we need to partner much more closely than we had in the past, and we have to have a much stronger analytical understanding in terms of how to go forward. And then maybe I'll just make a comment about 4 puzzles or tensions that I see that's part of that. One is the role of randomized controlled trials versus clinical judgment. And you have Michael Lauer has done an excellent job making the case for randomized controlled trials. Recently, there was an editorial in JACS by Steinberg making the case that we can't wait for those randomized trials. They're too big, they're too simple, it takes too long to get to those. So we need to deal with that tension. A second tension is reimbursement, something I mentioned in a roundtable the other day, and that is that, I'll make a provocative statement, and that is docs don't practice medicine anymore, payers practice medicine because they determine what drugs get used, what diagnostics get offered. So what we need to do is work more closely with that reimbursement arm of the government and insurance agents to better understand what is the information, what is the evidence they need in order to reimburse. The third puzzle is provisional versus long-term approval. I think it's really important for us to begin operating on data that we think is strong enough for a smaller group of people who is at higher risk. But then as we gather more and more data, phase 4 studies, surveillance studies, we can then push that out to individuals where the cost benefit isn't as dramatic as it would be initially. And then the last puzzle is guidelines. Typically payers reimburse for guidelines. But when we take a look at guidelines, and for the cardiologist in the audience, ATP4 is conservatively 2 years later than they thought it was going to be. And not only are they aged from the standpoint of when they get developed, but in addition to that, they require consensus. And consensus requires one to identify treatments and diagnostic tests that fit for everybody. Whereas what we're really looking at in personalized medicine is being able to look at a much smaller group of people with those kinds of tools. So we need to figure out how to operate outside of consensus guidelines, although with evidence.
Okay. In the interest of focusing this conversation around what I first asked, and to be a little bit provocative, let me say that the database that has been set up that is public, that requires the pharmaceutical industry to list all relationships with academia, and the need that we have to manage all those potential conflicts, have taken a lot of young people who we need to work with us to bridge this relationship, to make this relationship real, have produced a lot of trepidation on their part. That we have produced a kind of criminalization of this relationship. And what I want you to focus on is how do we get beyond that if we're going to facilitate the innovation that we need from both sides?
Yeah, I mean, coming a little bit back to your first question, then expanding to the second part, you know, I agree with everything you said at the beginning, with the exception, I don't think it's a recent phenomenon. I think there's probably some highlights that happened recently, but overall, I mean, I spent my first 10 years working on the academic side, but working closely with industry. Now, spent my second 10 years on the industry side, but working closely with academia as well. So I think the interaction has always been there. The recognition that both need to work together has always been there. I think what you highlight is there have been some increased scrutiny of some of the interactions, and I think rightfully so. I think we have a responsibility from the academic side, from the industry side, to patients, to taxpayers, about how the money is being spent. And I think being transparent about it, coming to John's point, I think is absolutely key, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think we can and need to do better how we, probably jointly, as the healthcare industry, so to speak, we need to do better how we communicate about the need to work together, and that it's not about personal enrichment necessarily, but rather really optimally applying the leverage and the knowledge that we have in both cases. Because as you said, it's complementary, right? A lot of cases, the early, let's say, target identification, target validation work is done to a very large degree in academia. And we as an industry always need this. On the other hand, I think the development of assets of drugs against that is done very effectively in industry. But you can do this very well together. I mean, we just spoke about this earlier. The Center for Therapeutic Innovation that we have implemented, for example, is one of these steps where you have in a very transparent way academic investigators and industry investigators sitting in the same lab, being very clear about what the goals are, what the successful end game should look like, coming back to your point. Be very clear what you're looking for. And I think it's very important, though, that if we build these partnerships, we don't build this on one-way flow of money or IP or things like that. We build it on mutual scientific interest, where really both parties feel, and it comes down to the individual investigator, really both parties feel they can do something together they couldn't do alone. And I think once you have that, you have a much more successful base for good collaboration. And I think as we have success and build success out of these and we communicate those right, I think the pendulum will swing back a little bit to a more rational perspective.
No, Paul? Your thoughts?
Well, if you look at the people behind the institutions, whether you work in industry or in academia, I think basically we have all the same objectives. We have the same objective on doing good science, translational science, bringing medicine, which prolong life and improve quality of life. That's the basics, whether you come into our organization and probably in the hospitals, everywhere, the basics is how can we help people? The difference is that we are an industry and have to create a return on investment. You are funded by NIH, by other systems. And that is where basically I think the misunderstanding is that we are there just to make money. You are there to just to service and to do science. Well, I feel that our organizations are as essential part of healthcare and society than hospitals, because in the end we bring new products which you use to treat cancer, to treat HIV, to treat hepatitis C. And I think we have to do a much better job on explaining on how our industry works and why it is so capital intensive and why do we need profits in order to get returns on investment to shareholders to make the circle continue to go. Yeah? We invest billions of dollars every year in R&D. We are probably the most capital-intensive industry there is with the highest risk. And that requires a return before people give us the money to do so. So I think giving much more clarity on and insight on who we are, what we do, but at the same time have respect for the both sides, where each of us are there to help healthcare forward. And I think that's much better communication, much better understanding, and then also towards the authorities, and of course avoid excesses. Yeah, that's where always the places where we get the attention and we are in the bad light. The good things are not seen that much. The years of life saved over the last 20 years by our industry, combined with the scientific community, is just massive. Yeah. But the excesses of financial excesses always come out as the negatives. And I think putting more balance in how we make the world understand on who we are, what we do, is, I think, the most important way to rebalance that relationship.
Buzz?
So I think the expectations of our industry are just tremendous. I think I'm old enough, the students here won't remember, but I'm old enough to remember a time when infectious disease was the biggest killer in the world, and Paul's an infectious disease doctor, he'll tell you that's the case. So the expectations on us in terms of efficacy and safety are tremendous. And I think we just have to acknowledge that and, you know, and just realize that's the fact as we go forward. The second thing I pointed about trust, I think we have to have about trust. I think Paul's point is absolutely correct. We can all agree on a big idea that we'd all like to work together. But I think as we work with academics, I think having clear expectations of what you do and how you do it and how you communicate on a day-to-day level is really what it's about. Make sure your expectations are clear as you go forward. Obviously, that requires much, much better communications. And I think the other thing is that I think pharma needs to take a much, much broader perspective and communicate that broader perspective. Health now is a global thing. Any of you who watch TED Talks looks at Nathan Wolf's talk about how viruses go around the world so fast these days. It's a very, very scary thing. And I think pharmaceuticals have become from a localized thing to a much broader perspective. At Gilead, we're privileged to work on HIV. We are, along with Paul's organization, make a tremendous difference in that area. We treat about 800,000 people with HIV medicine, but along with Paul and J&J's access program, we actually give away about medication for about 2.5 to 3 million people at no cost. And that kind of broader perspective needs to be shown to the world as we think about not only diseases that we treat, but diseases in emerging markets. And we just need to communicate that better. And we need to be very, very clear about the expectations upon us in terms of safety. Jeff Hammermacher referred to Vioxx. I mean, the side effect of Vioxx got into trouble for was 8, I think, in 10,000 patients. And you will never find that out unless you do large phase 4 trials and the expectations that sets on us. So I think we just need to be clear about what we're doing. And I think society needs to understand the risk-benefit ratio of what we do.
So, you know, as we acknowledge that we need each other and society needs us to work together well, we also come to this conundrum. 10, 20 years ago, it was relatively easy for us to find venture capital. We could take a patent and from paper start a company, get the support that we needed, and then turn to big pharma sometime later and say, you know, we're pretty close here. We got an early phase 2. We got a proof of concept. Let's take it a little further. So now we know what we've all talked about. There's this valley of death between the time that we come up with good targets and good ideas and maybe lead molecules, and you're interested. I know that the members of this panel have been trying to bridge that gap and find creative ways that we can still work together. But I come back to something that Paul said, which is as important for J&J as it is for the big VCs, and that is they still need a return on investment. I mean, the risk to you to fund us early is just as big as the risk to VCs because you've still got shareholders at the end of the day who can't support the kind of black hole that academia can be. So the question is, how do you see bridging the valley of death? How do we get our compounds further along so that society can ultimately benefit from them?
Yeah, I guess the way I would answer that is coming back to an earlier comment I made, and that is that what's difficult to make the case for, as Paul was saying, is this gigantic investment before you know whether or not the investment is worthwhile. So I think what we need to do is be less ambitious from the standpoint of how many patients a particular new drug or a combination of a drug and a diagnostic will address. Because that will provide two things. Number one, it will get care to those people who need it quickest, which all of us are interested in. The second thing it will do is it'll provide confidence in the stakeholders that are involved, that this really represents an opportunity for them from the standpoint of return on investment. So that's what I would do. I would recommend that we think of it not from the standpoint of being in it for the long term and trying to deal with the risk, but in fact building milestones that provide value to patients sooner and give data to people about whether that investment is worthwhile.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, in addition, I think we all refer to it as the valley of death. I think there's still life in the valley of death. And I think that should not be forgotten. I mean, yes, the funding has gotten tighter and the selection has gotten more stringent, which might not be a bad process overall to look for quality and really focus in our investments. But also, I think as we've seen that gap develop, there have been lots of different approaches to trying to address it. You made reference to S4, but I think across the industry, I think there's lots of different approaches to bridge as much as we can. We talked about CTI, we talked about other initiatives as well. But academic institutions also, I think, have started to take their part of the responsibility and starting to build, and I think Mount Sinai is one of the examples, to really build an infrastructure where novel ideas can be fostered in the very early stages to develop and generate data that makes it more attractive and develop a higher level of comfort for biotech or pharma to invest into. I think as we can, coming back to your first question actually, as we can build that relationship even tighter, I think we can bridge that valley probably fairly effectively as we go forward.
Do you want to speak to some of the things that you guys are doing to bridge that valley? Some of the innovative programs you've got?
Yeah, so I mean, there's several activities, and I think each company has their own little approach to it. But for Pfizer, number one is what we call the Center for Therapeutic Innovation. We made a few references to it. For those of you who are not familiar with this, we have built in 3 cities so far, New York, Boston, and on the West Coast, San Francisco, labs that really interact directly with a number of academic institutions. Boston and New York, it's 8 or 9 different institutions. Mount Sinai is one of them, where we ask for these innovative ideas that are probably not ready to be spun out in a biotech necessarily, but that are very attractive and we view have a lot of potential. And we work then with the academic investigator together, physically actually together in the same lab. Here in New York, our labs are down at 28th Street in the East River Science Park, right behind the Bellevue Hospital. And in that we have a number of 20, 30, 40 programs that we're working on with a reasonable number of investigators, but a large machinery we can offer from a large pharma company of accelerating these programs to test ideas in first-in-man very quickly. Other examples include seed funds, or the Pfizer Venture Group, for example, and a lot of other pharma companies have venture functions as well, that start to invest often into early ideas that are linked to the R&D pipeline in a more aggressive form and shape. And also, we have really moved to a model where we invest into specific projects within academic institutions outside of CTI, for example, across the globe. Building closer networks to tech transfer offices, but in general to academic institutions to learn about these ideas that can be readily applied to needs that we have and invest in them early on.
Okay, Paul?
Well, I think the value of that and the lack of money for early biotech companies is real. It's a big challenge, but at the same time, I think we in industry and you in academia, we could do a lot by trying to bridge that. And on the one hand, Well, I set up my own biotech companies, and I spent probably 3 times the capital I should have, yeah? Because you always try to build infrastructure, hire people. Today, when I run my company, I had 200-300 people. Today, I would do it with 20 or 30, exactly 10%, and share much more of the capabilities. So today, in industry, I think we can facilitate by a lot of things, but especially, well, we can facilitate by capital, by investing our money, but also by resources. Not everyone has to have high throughput screening, not everyone has to have upscaling facilities, toxicology facilities. If the industry, and I think we are going there, can share much of the capabilities which early biotech companies need, the amount of capital which would be needed to set up a company is so much less. So what is a mechanism that we can use? We have also started incubators, so to have hosting companies where the companies can get access to our tools, to our capabilities, to our people. We leverage through our venture capital group a lot of money. But I am a believer that by making the mechanism from, let's say, an invention, a target, to a translational experiments to proof of concept, by sharing resources, capabilities, know-how, we can make it much, much cheaper. Also, the way you set up companies, it has to be, you have to know when to start, but you also have to know when to stop. Yeah, and do the killing experiment first. Think very hard on what is the bridge you have to make, the bridge you have to pass here, the level you have to pass here to get to the next stage. So learning on my own failures, I think we can make it much more viable for biotech companies, early stage biotech companies, is if academic side, and we work together to create a space where that can happen. So,
and I actually think you see a lot of these activities currently with venture capital even approaching pharma companies to work with them in spinning out new companies. So.
We have invested, we are working with several venture capital companies, and today, many times it's about asset-centric. It's just about, this is the molecule we're going to work on. We jointly invest in it, we do the experiment, and we incentivize people to be successful, but at the same time, we incentivize to stop on time. That experiment, the thing is not good enough, let's go to something else. And let's make sure that we circle through massive number of new compounds through that type of mechanism, and in order to minimize the capital and increase the probability of success.
So, you know, I would say that it's important when you think about the question you asked is to get the vocabulary right. I think what's become hard is exits for VCs, not necessarily getting money into companies. I think large pharma fund companies a lot, actually. There's a lot of deals. We do a lot of, you know, collaboration deals. We do a lot of asset-driven deals. We do a lot of money goes into them. What becomes hard is getting exits, which is that VCs put money in there and get their money back out. That's where the dilemma is. So the thing, I think that, one of the reasons for that is that over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a lot more money put into companies than then traditionally had been in the 80s. So we need to go back to a model where there's a lot less money put in up front. You take the risk, as Paul says, you do an earn-out, you get a conditional exit driven in there, and then people get their money out that way. I think ultimately, companies and universities have to start working together much, much more and just take the risk together. We've done that in other places. Paul and Pfizer have done that, and J&J and Pfizer have done that. I think that's what's going to happen. I think you'll see over the next 10 years a greater collaboration between universities and larger companies, and the middle people, which would be the VCs, I think will take a much more circumscribed role as we go forward.
So let's talk about how we view each other's data.
How would I, sorry?
How we view each other's data. Because for us to really work effectively, there's got to be this trust in the data that we generate. And there would be some who would say that in the industry side, that the data that is presented by the academics when they try to sell their products is overstated. I think John said the sin of the small sample size. They wind up with false positive results, and they overstate those false positive results. And on the other side, they're the view of many of the academicians who are not your collaborators that everything that they read in a journal that is sponsored by the company is a biased presentation. And the worst thing that's happened is when a Glaxo has to come forward and admit to fraud in suppressing science that should have been in some of their submissions or some of their articles. So what are your thoughts on how do we get over the mistrust of our data sets?
Well, I'll take that one. It takes a long time to get a deal done. It doesn't happen in 3 days. And I think, if those of you who are involved with companies know, you start talking, it takes 9 months, 12 months. I think over that time, trust will build up, and you will eventually get to a point where you trust each other's data. I think there will always be excesses. You cannot get rid of excess. You cannot get rid of, if you want to go out and lie, people will go out, there's nothing you can do to stop that. So I think, but you have to go in it and build up trust and then go forward as you go, as the relationship progresses. And I think in the main, I would think most of the data that we look at is good. I think it's certainly the people who do it, generate it, are being truthful. I think it is, as John says, does it stand up, is it robust enough? That's the question. And I think you can easily put in place relationships where you allow that data to be tested and then have a relationship that actually builds on that. You get milestones as that data becomes more and more robust. I think it's just being clear about our expectations and being realistic about our expectations and being clear on what we want out of the relationship.
Well, I think it's being 25 years in the industry, you learn that whatever exaggeration of data you do, it always catches up with you.
Exactly.
Yeah? So and if you exaggerate on selling a product and the data don't work out, well, the product doesn't go to the market because and there are no royalties coming back to the institution. So for me, honesty on the data, honesty on the research, honesty on the findings is the most important success factor in our business, because it always catches up with you. Yeah? And today, the only way to get to a good therapeutic solution or a good drug is making sure that when you learn something and there is something wrong, or the data are not good enough, you have to go back and fix it. Yeah? And you have to work to the ultimate optimal product, because otherwise it doesn't reach the market. Whether it's efficacy or safety, it always catches up with you in a controlled trial, in large data sets. You invest and you fail and you misinvest hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's why that's the most important thing I ask from our people, is to be always 100% honest on the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if that is the way you have to operate, otherwise there's no success.
The only other thing I might add is the distinction between statistically significant and clinically relevant. And oftentimes in a research setting, people are focused on the p-value, what's statistically significant. But what's really required is, for translation, is really to have that actionable in some way. Yes, it's statistically significant, but does it have an effect size that's clinically relevant that leads to a different action? I think that's a really important appreciation.
I think we need to be also careful not to generalize. I think someone said it earlier, I think the real bad intended, by design flawed, let's say, incidences that you were referring to have gotten a lot of press, but I think those are the few exceptions, lucky-wise. I think lack of robust data, I think, might be more of an issue where you simply didn't have a chance to run a large N or run the PK/PD properly, to really look into all the potential caveats of it. But I think it doesn't matter where you are, if in industry or if you're in academia. If you want to, if you want to build a house, you want to build it on a solid foundation. And I think you always check the foundation. I mean, you're going to have to make sure that what you build your career on, what you build your lab on, what you build your activities on, or invest hundreds of millions of dollars into, has the robustness that it needs. So sometimes it requires that you redo the experiment, but I've done this when I was in academia. Yeah. I'm doing it in industry. So I think that's something we need to be careful. And again, it comes back a little bit to the communication piece you mentioned earlier. We jointly, I think, need to do a better job in making this clear.
Can I add something? I think what's very important is that you need to create an environment where people can fail. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And where the leaders stand up for the failure. You take the risk, I as the leader take the blame if things go wrong. Because if you don't have an environment where people can fail, then if they lose their job when their experiments go wrong, at that moment, people have a good incentive not to do the right thing. Yeah? And that is a very, very important learning in industry, learning in our world is like make sure that people can come up with failures without blame. Yeah.
I actually think we are, as an industry, shifting towards really incentivizing the quick kill, incentivizing the honesty of coming forward, saying, you know, this does not work. And I think that's very important. If you have an environment where only successes count, advance to the next stage or so, you do create an environment where you will add some bias to it. But if you measure people's performance, simple things like can you come to a clear scientific decision? Yes or no is secondary to that. I think that's very important, and I think we see a clear shift towards that over the years.
Over my career, I've watched the relationship between industry and academia from lots of different sides. I've helped companies discover and bring drugs to market, and I've watched intellectual property develop, but I've also seen our ability to sell to you guys through the tech transfer office. And I want to put on the hat for a second of what I see from your side in a minute. And that is the frustrations that I've seen industry have in dealing with academia. And maybe you can tell us some of the frustrations that you've come up with, because I know, as I've been an ally of you and watch it happen at times, the frustration that can happen in getting a deal done, in bringing the scientists to be reasonable and having appropriate expectations. Tell us, so they can hear what sometimes are your frustrations in dealing with us.
Yeah, so I think probably one of the most important aspects of vocabulary frustration is the overestimate of the value of what has been done, even though it's not as far down the value chain, without an appreciation of what still needs to be invested in terms of going forward. Is probably the most important aspect of that. Is there some way we can build a relationship where there's not only an increased familiarity of what needs to get done, because then there's I think a more practical look at what's been created, but in addition to that, perhaps identifying for each other, here's how we value that, but if you did X, here's how we would value that. So that you would have the opportunity to either say, well, we don't want to take it any further down the value chain, so we have to accept that your estimate of value, or the people I talk to, is the level of value, or internally investing in the necessary experimentation studies to take it further down the value chain, the data accumulation, so that there's less that pharma or the diagnostics company needs to invest in terms of making it a reality.
I think evaluation and IP have been probably the most common stumble blocks for us. But I would say it's probably on both sides, to be in all fairness. I think we as an industry, and including Pfizer, I think in the old days sometimes have been very persistent on certain IP regulations. And we have undergone some learnings. As you can imagine, if you build the Center for Therapeutic Innovation with 8 or 9 academic institutions in New York or Boston, there's lots of ego around the table. That's on both sides, the industry side and the academia, and you really want to come together because you do see the bigger benefit, but you have to deal with some of these historical perceptions and burdens, sometimes real burdens sometimes. But it can be done, and I think that's actually very good to see, that we are coming much more to a better understanding about how value can be created, how risk can be shared early on, and I think you made the point that risk sharing has to be a very big piece in this. But there needs to also be fair valuation towards the academic institution if it is successful. And I think we also learned that sometimes IP protection is not as critical in certain parts of the process than we thought. I mean, to be quite honest, if we would put our portfolios openly on the table, we probably have, 95, 98, 99+% identical programs, because we pick targets typically from the same sources, publications, meetings, the KOLs. It's very limited, really proprietary number of targets out there. And so I think if you can give on those areas where it's not as critical, where you're really not as differentiated maybe between the industries, but then focus your IP protection, for example, on the chemical matter, on the antibodies, on the peptides you develop around it, that helps the academic institutions, and it helps us as well. So I think we're getting in the right direction. I think, in all fairness, we still have, from time to time, certain interactions with certain institutions where we are simply struggling, where there's still either too high expectations on value early on, or the IP aspect is simply not acceptable for us because it would put us in a very difficult position in a global context, where we then have to decide to cut bait and move on.
Well, I can only comment in a similar way, is that IP is central to our existence. If we invest ultimately between $1 and $4 billion in getting a product to the market, and there an IP protection is absolutely central. And the uncertainty about that determines a lot of where the value is, how good it is protected, and then the value expectation based on the current, especially on the current healthcare environment. If you look at the current drug development paradigm, where before a target in diabetes could be like, wow, this is a multi-billion-dollar product. Today, the challenge to get there is just huge, and more we'll have to invest in much smaller drugs because we only can have part of smaller indications, and therefore the value and return on investment is going to be significantly lower. And then another issue we have in industry is the stacking of royalties on many of our products, especially in the antibody space, where if you calculate it all up, then each little piece, each little discovery adds to the product royalty, and in the end the cost of goods become unbearable based on the royalties. So all of that, I think, probably is also needs more transparency from our side on how make people understand. But today there are very few products in our industry which are sold with less than 10-15% royalties to third parties. Yeah, very few. Yeah, because and based on that and the pricing pressure today, how can we make a viable product where it's a real challenge, and having the understanding from both sides for that, and probably more risk-based, more incentive-based deals, where if there is a success, the bigger the success, the bigger your share will be. But that is more thinking.
You know, I would agree everything about IP. I think that's paramount. I think looking at that, and control, obviously how you manage the control of the collaboration is critical. Very few institutions will give up control, so I think we need to be clear on what we want out of it and let you run it. You know, I'll give you a funny example. I think there's an elitism in some of the higher level universities that you have to deal with. I remember we were negotiating a clause that said at the end of the relationship, all the reports had to be put into a form that would be acceptable to major journals in the area. And the comment I got back was, this institution only writes reports of the highest caliber, and the clause was deleted. And so I think there needs to be a greater understanding of what we want at the end of it and how we work together, and that development's hard. It really is hard. You know, it takes 7 to 9 years to take a product. You test it in thousands of patients. And the people that Paul and Uwe and John talk about, they spent many decades learning how to do this. And there is a contribution to be made by the other side. I would say that's an important factor.
We're going to open it up to questions. But I just got to come back to an IP question. Because it's a reality that we face here in academia. We're not so good sometimes at thinking about when we should file the patent. Sometimes we file it late, and you know, everything winds up getting litigated. It's almost an expectation that whatever patents we're going to generate is going to wind up someplace in court. And a lot of the things that we're very good at is figuring out new uses, and use patents are increasingly useless. You can't support them, and Hatch-Waxman legislation takes us out of the marketplace after 4.5 years. And you've taken 9 years in development. So here's my question. In Japan, market exclusivity is 9 years. In Europe, it's 5 years for the data package, and then 5 more if you've done it right. Is IP really that important in reality? Is the reality of where the industry is going is that we have no choice but to accept the fact that we're going to have a lot less protection, and yet there are public needs for certain compounds that must move forward, and we're all going to just have to find a way to make that work? Or do we still interface with the academics and say, look, forget about those uses. That's a weak patent that you have here without synthesis and matter and composition. We're not going to take it. Because what I'm asking you is, isn't the reality of the way this plays out that you really have a lot less protection than you want anyway, and you're getting market exclusivity in a lot of big markets anyway?
Well, if the breakthrough is big enough, yeah, you can do it without IP protection. But the biggest market is in the US, typically 50–60% of the market in the world. The rest is in Europe and Japan, and then a little in the rest of the world. So if you have a drug with no IP protection, and we have some cancer drugs which we develop with no IP protection, you need to recoup your investment in 5 years. Yeah? And that's 5–6 years, let's say, and that's a huge challenge. And it also is then the challenge to do additional indications. Typically a cancer compound, you have 1 indication, 2, 3, 4, 5, and expanding. You can do that to a certain extent, but it limits the potential of the product if you don't have IP protection. But if the product is a breakthrough and there is no IP protection, there is a way to do it. But the value you bring has to be huge, has to be fast, and it has to be competitive.
No, I think that's important for us to hear.
Yeah.
So let's open it to questions, and Teri will take it from here.
All right. John.
Yeah. So early in this panel, somebody mentioned the great expense and importance of randomized clinical trials. And I don't do clinical trials, so this may be a naive question, but I've always been a bit frustrated by it because I'm convinced that there'll be at least a dozen mechanistic causes of Alzheimer's disease, and maybe far more than a dozen. And the same thing with schizophrenia, the same thing with most of the brain disorders. So aren't you, with a randomized clinical trial, if you define the phenotype as schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease, and you don't define it as Alzheimer's disease number 17, aren't you almost by definition going to get a confused result and lose the fact that the new drug that you're trying to develop helped 10%, didn't do anything to 50%, and hurt 1%. And until we can define the diseases more mechanistically, aren't we sort of doomed to that kind of confusion from randomized clinical trials?
Yes, so I think you've identified 2 important points. I couldn't agree with you more that the concept of a large, simple trial is not applicable to complex diseases. If we're going to approach them mechanistically, which is what we want to do, then we shouldn't be having large, simple trials. We need to focus those on smaller groups. Now, we need to know what those smaller groups are before we do those, but that's critically important. The other point, which you kind of alluded to, which I think is important to comment on, and that is that randomized clinical trials, although held up as being the strongest evidence for moving forward, what is sometimes overlooked is that when those drugs or diagnostic tests get used in the clinical community, the individuals that are using those, the docs and the patients, sometimes don't look as much like that randomized controlled trial inclusion and exclusionary criteria as you'd like. Randomized controlled trials generally have younger, less ill patients. And as a result, we move into testing, we move into using those drugs and diagnostics in people that formerly haven't been tested. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that that randomized controlled trials do have a high level of evidence, but given the complexity of disease, we need to begin thinking about not large, simple trials, but smaller targeted trials, and we need to begin asking the question, can we do community-based studies? One of the points that I thought was really interesting and perplexing is someone was looking at genotyping for the metabolism of P450 genes. And the requirement for the regulatory agency was that the randomized controlled trial be done in the highest level thrombosis clinic that did the best job in managing thrombosis. And on the surface, that sounds like the right thing to do, but then when you ask, well, what fraction of everybody treated actually goes through those kinds of clinics, you find out it's actually a relatively small percentage. So what we need to do is deal with the puzzle of, so how do you design that randomized controlled trial that allows you to fairly look at the benefit of a drug or a diagnostic in the people that are actually going to use it, rather than simply the best, because the best is not the treatment we have for everybody.
Good. Yes.
Well, Paul, you said that if you were starting a biotech company now, you could do it with about 1/10 as many people. What does that say about the stresses on the system that you're running now? I mean, do you need as many people as you need now? Are the costs there as low as they can be at this point?
That's a very good question. But what we do in our industry today is do probably double or triple the work we have to do from before, and especially in the development. The biggest amount of work gets into that, and that it's like a zero defect environment. It's like you would be amazed if those of you who are in development on the stress on quality today in clinical trials in the world, and it is that monitor who is going to that San Francisco site who yes or no picks up a mistake in a clinical trial, which determines the ultimate result of your $1 billion investment. And the cascade of quality, which needs to grow to our organizations, require just a horrendous number of people to make sure that we have the quality to present to the FDA and the European and the worldwide regulatory authorities, because the smallest mistake breaks your investment. And that's why still a massive number of people are needed in development. In the earlier stages, I think it's very much what most of us in industry do is collaboration, and then have centers of excellence to do certain activities. When I started in Janssen and J&J, we had like 6 toxicology centers in the world. Today we have 1. Yeah, we have 1 very efficient, which is outsourcing, and which only a limited number of capabilities were the real essential capabilities. I'm open to share that with the rest of the biotech industry to use that. The same in all different disciplines. We have gone through huge efficiencies and huge headcount reductions also in all of our organizations to get to the essential of what we need. So I can't say we can do a pharmaceutical company with 1,000 people and developing like 2 or 3 NMEs every year. It's impossible. But we got to those efficiencies. I think the early companies, if today you're a biotech company, and what you have to do is control, I think what I would do is control the essential value creating part and do nothing more than that. Toxicology, pharmacology, clinical trials, regulatory, medical writing, everything you can source out today. Where in my days, I all had it internally. And that is absolutely not needed. So.
Just to add to this, I think, you try to identify where you're really competitive. And I think that's where you focus your internal resources on and shrink, as much as you can. But safety is the ultimate measure. You can't, there's a critical mass. If you go under this, you start to risk safety. And I think no one around this table, no one in the industry really wants that. So I think we're coming closer to that critical mass, I think, significantly over the last years. But I think we need to be very cautious not to go under that critical mass either.
Yeah, thank you.
Our safety infrastructure today is probably as large as our research infrastructure in the company.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you. Scott.
Comment and then a question. The comment about post-approval data is an interesting one, and Jeff Hammerbacher sort of educated me to a new way of thinking about this from his perspective, which is that basically phase 1, 2, and 3 are beta testing in the software world. Everything that really matters is what happens in the real world use, and therefore data systems need to be able to collect that even if it's not in the context of a controlled randomized trial. My question is actually from Twitter, from one of our postdocs here, and that is, addressing the interface between research in academia and research in industry. And I wonder, in the context of externalizing a lot of R&D, whether you see the role of academic centers and the scope of what they do as investigators changing, expanding. Where does the interface now lie, and where should it be between where academic research stops or ends and pharma research begins?
Do you want to give that one a try?
That's the hardest one so far. So I think industry and academic, and obviously this is a continuum. I would say academic intercession with industry is bimodal. I would say you can make a huge amount of difference at the front end. There are clearly things, it's a non-overlapping, non-coincident Venn diagram. At the front end, I think you can make a tremendous difference in terms of working on biological pathways, doing basic biology and things like that, up through to the point of target identification, and even, I think, in the early stages of drug discovery. And I think, as you said, Scott, on the phase 4 stuff, you know, these investigator-sponsored programs, in those kinds of things that goes out looking at specific patient populations and things like that, I think you can, academics can make a tremendous difference there. But in the middle, which is late-stage drug discovery, development, and as Paul says, safety, toxicology, what's hardcore development, I think it's too labor-intensive. I think it's too cost-intensive. I think it's not where your bailiwick is. It's not what you do well. But I think on the bimodal piece of it, I think you can do that tremendously well. I don't know if you'd agree.
No, I would fully agree with it. I would add to this, though, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to your question. I think it depends on the specific interaction, the program, what you're working on. It also depends actually on the investigators. I think there are investigators who are happy to share the idea and then stay back and worry about the next new target and next new breakthrough technology platform they want to develop, because they don't see their forte really in managing a spin-off company or driving the business part of that. There are others who are actually very good in this, and you want to keep engaged. Probably not when it comes to large-scale tox studies or scale-up of material. I think that's where you need the infrastructure and the know-how to do it effectively. But I think there's a broad spectrum where this can be applied, and I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, I think it's really important that, you know, we're in this race together in terms of helping patients. And if any one of us says, well, that's not our job, we're not going to get to where we need to be. So I think Uwe's point is exactly well taken, and that is each of us have to use our passions and our skill sets to determine where in that value chain we're going to participate.
Great. Yes.
Hi. So I thought I'd ask a question about the ecosystem in which we're in relation to the fact that you're all very aware on the panel, or at least half of you I know are aware, that Mount Sinai is taking a leading edge. Just you see it with this particular conference, but you also see it with that unusual talk that started off today. This morning's talk is quite unusual for many of our medical academic centers. And I would quickly say that this, I know Uwe would agree with me that the CTI would not have happened for Pfizer if it hadn't been for Mount Sinai's key role in the original negotiation of that discussion. And so what I wanted to get at was that, and many people in the audience may not think about it, New York has the opportunity to take a dramatically leading role in life sciences in ways that it hasn't in the past, and that's part of the reason that you all are here and interested in it. Paul's been interested in it as well. And sitting in a room with, I would say, arguably the academic medical center that's most aware of it and most aware of what can be done to do better drug discovery, what would you say that might be interesting about the role that Mount Sinai can play as you see the next decade, when, from your point of view, all the companies are looking for the kinds of efficiencies you mentioned, and not bilateral alliances with individual institutions, much less individual investigators. You need some kind of efficient alliances and public-private partnerships that will go after the big challenges. And you have right in front of you a sort of an unusually visionary entity trying to do that. What can Mount Sinai do that plays both to its strengths, but actually helps you in developing efficiencies in ecosystem, so it's not in London or in Shanghai or some other place.
Thank you, Ellis. I feel compelled to say that that was not a commercial. Ellis does not work for Mount Sinai. He's the CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. Thank you.
The first thing I might say is, and this is a biased perception on my part, and that is you need to look at a world bigger than pharma, bigger than drugs. And that's because drugs work better in patients with specific biomarkers. So Mount Sinai needs to place the same emphasis they place in drug discovery in biomarker development, and when biomarkers get used in drugs. So that might be the first statement that I make.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with this, and I think it was said before, the two ends of the spectrum that we talked about, right? Early from drug discovery, target validation, getting to the lead piece, and then also in the clinical aspects. I think that's where interaction with academia and institutions like Mount Sinai have been in the past very fruitful, and hopefully will be more fruitful as we go forward. I would add one comment that John made, and this is that I think it's important that as an institution you also think about where do you want to go, what's your strategy? And if your strategy is you really want to become a more applied environment where a lot of the work that you do, basic work often, really needs to be more driven towards an application, be it in healthcare, or be it in technologies, wherever it is. It's important to recognize that individual investigators have different interests. And our experience has been there are some investigators who are very eager to work with industry. Again, I apologize for drumming the advertisement here for the CTI, but what we have learned there is you identify investigators who really have what I would call the right mindset for partnering with us, which is they are driven to find an application as fast as possible for their idea that they have. But there are other investigators as well who love to work in the basic science. There's nothing wrong with it. We need the diversity. But I think filtering which are the ones I'm trying to tap into for this interactions and which are the ones are probably too much time and energy because they're not interested in investing. I think that's an important piece as well on both sides, on our end as well as the academic institution side.
Great. Paul?
I think the most important thing is stay too close where you're very good at. It is the combination of patients and science. That is something which is unique, which we in industry cannot do. We can work on animals, yeah? We can't work in a research on patients. And I think what is happening, a lot of information, and looking at the first presentation today, a lot of information is in your clinical networks, in your clinical data, response, non-response to certain drugs. I think most of the drugs, even in new inventions, are done by learning from the clinic, and that's where you have a unique situation to build a huge capability in doing research in the interface between on the human, on the patients, and the scientific discoveries on biomarkers, on predictive parameters, why patients respond yes or no, and learning from that to get to the next therapies. I think also learning on how that can you do, what are combination therapies and biomarkers. So I would experiment as much as I could with the combination of that interface, science and patient know-how. And if we can, I think that's so unique that's why you will become a very attractive group for collaborations with industry.
I really enjoyed the, was it hack, crash, and be happy about it approach in the earlier presentation, though I think in the healthcare business we need to be a little bit cautious about the crashing part, obviously. But having that said, I think I just wanted to add to the comment, I think there's true value in not just how we collect information. And I think we're doing pretty well, and we heard it earlier this morning, we do pretty well in sampling and collecting information. I think where we have the true challenge is what to do with the information. How do I have the right algorithms to draw the right conclusion? A, what is the right questions to ask? Often we don't know really what the question is we're asking going into that. That has been a problem. But then B, how do we crunch the data to really have meaningful output of it, not just have numbers? Because if you invest into a database, if you invest into collecting data, you're kind of forced into doing something with the data. But if we don't know what we're asking, if we don't know really how to interpret and meaningfully interpret those data, I think that's a huge challenge. And I think, particularly from a safety, but even from an efficacy perspective, I think that's an area where if academia and different parts of academia, not just the life sciences piece, but even the technology arm, could be extremely helpful in advancing us to the next stage.
Muz, you have the last one.
Well, I agree with everything everybody said about, translational medicine being excellent at what you do, but I go back to, and I apologize for the simplistic nature of this argument. Students, your primary goal, one of your primary goals is to produce the best students, the best MDs in the world. They are your best advertisement. They are your biggest enticement. If you have a really good postdoc, he or she will come to Gilead or J&J or Pfizer or Celera. They will shock the world. They will know more about the disease than I know. If the latest graduate from Mount Sinai doesn't know more than I do, then there's a mistake going on here. They are the people who will look at the data. They are the people who will question us. They are the people who will challenge us in what we think about diseases. So at the risk of being simplistic, your biggest, as I say, your best students are the things we need. We need to hire them. We need to employ them. We need to engage them and be good at what you do. And if you do that, I think we will come begging to you to work with us. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, it's time for us to wrap up. Please join Ken and I in thanking our panel.